The Wreck of the Whale Ship Essex by Owen Chase, the first mate. The town of Nantucket in the state of Massachusetts contains about 8,000 inhabitants. Nearly a third part of the population are Quakers, and they are, taken together, a very industrious and enterprising people. On this island are owned about 100 vessels of all descriptions engaged in the whale trade, giving constant employment and support to upwards of 1,600 hardy seamen, a class of people proverbial for their intrepidity. This fishery is not carried on to any extent from any other part of the United States, except from the town of New Bedford, directly opposite to Nantucket on the mainland, where are owned probably 20 sail. A voyage generally lasts about 2 years and a half with an entire uncertainty of success. Sometimes the whalemen are repaid with speedy voyages and profitable cargoes, but others they drag out a listless and disheartening cruise, scarcely making the expense of an outfit. The business is considered a very hazardous one, arising from unavoidable accidents in carrying on an exterminating warfare against those great leviathans of the deep. Indeed, a Nantucket man is on all occasions fully sensible of the honor and merit of his profession, no doubt because he knows that his laurels, like the soldiers, are plucked from the brink of danger. Numerous anecdotes are related of the whalemen of Nantucket. Stories of hairbreadth escapes and sudden and wonderful preservation are handed down amongst them with the fidelity, and no doubt with the character fictions, of the ancient legendary tales. A spirit of adventure amongst the sons and other relatives of those immediately concerned in the fishery takes possession of their minds at a very early age. Captivated with the tough stories of the elder seamen, and seduced by the natural desire of seeing foreign countries, as well as by the hopes of gain, they launch forth 6,000 or 8,000 miles from home into an almost untraversed ocean, where they spend from 2 to 3 years of their lives in scenes of constant peril, labor, and watchfulness. The profession is one of great ambition, and is full of honorable excitement. A tame man is never known amongst them, and the coward is marked with that particular aversion that distinguishes our public naval service. There are, perhaps, no people of superior corporeal powers, but it has been truly said that they possess a natural aptitude, which seems rather the lineal spirit of their fathers than the effects of any experience. The town itself, during the War of 1812, was naturally to have been expected on the decline, but with the return of peace it took a fresh start, and a spirit for carrying on the fishery received a renewed and very considerable excitement. Large amounts of capital are now invested, and some of the finest ships that our country can boast of are employed in it. The increasing demand, within a few years past, from the Spermaceti candle manufactories has induced companies and individuals in different parts of the Union to become engaged in the business. If the further consumption of the manufactured article should bear any proportion to that of the past few years, this species of commerce will bid fair to become the most profitable and extensive that our country possesses. From the accounts of those who were concerned with the early stages of the fishery, it would appear that the whales have been driven, like the beasts of the forest before the march of civilization, into remote and more unfrequented seas, until now they are followed by the enterprise and perseverance of our seamen, even to the distant coasts of Japan. The ship Essex, commanded by Captain George Pollard, Jr., was fitted out to Nantucket. She sailed on the 12th day of August, 1819, for the Pacific Ocean on the whaling voyage. Of this ship I was first mate. She had lately undergone a thorough repair in her upper works, and was at that time in all respects a sound, substantial vessel. She had a crew of 20 men, and was victualled and provided for 2 years and a half. We left the coast of America with a fine breeze, and steered for the western islands. On the second day out, while sailing moderately on our course in the Gulf Stream, a sudden squall of wind struck the ship from the southwest, and knocked her completely on her beam ends, stove one of our boats, entirely destroyed 2 others, and threw down the cambos. We distinctly saw the approach of this gust, but miscalculated altogether as to the strength and violence of it. It struck the ship about 3 points off the weather quarter, at the moment that the man at the helm was in the act of putting her away to run before it. In an instant she was knocked down, with her yards in the water. However, before hardly a moment of time was allowed for reflection, she gradually came to the wind and righted. The squall was accompanied with vivid flashes of lightning and heavy and repeated claps of thunder. The whole ship's crew were, for a short time, thrown into the utmost consternation and confusion. But, fortunately, the violence of the squall was all contained in the first gust of the wind. It soon gradually abated and became fine weather again. We repaired our damage with little difficulty and continued on our course with the loss of the 2 boats. On the 30th of August, we made the Island of Flores, one of the western group called the Azores. We lay off and on the island for 2 days, during which time our boats landed and obtained a supply of vegetables and a few hogs. From this place we took the northeast trade wind and, in 16 days, made the Isle of May, one of the Cape Verde group. As we were sailing along the shore of this island, we discovered a ship stranded on the beach, and, from her appearance, took her to be a whaler. Having lost 2 of our boats, and presuming that this vessel had probably some belonging to her that might have been saved, we determined to ascertain the name of the ship and to endeavor to supply, if possible, the loss of our boats from her. We accordingly stood in towards the port or landing place. After a short time, 3 men were discovered coming out to us in a whaleboat. In a few moments they were alongside. They informed us that the wreck was the Archimedes of New York, Captain George B. Coffin. This vessel had struck on a rock near the island before a fortnight previously. All hands were saved by running the ship on shore, and the captain and crew had since gone home. We purchased the whaleboat of these people, obtained some few more pigs, and again set sail. Our passage thence to Cape Horn was not distinguished for any incident worthy of note. We made the longitude of the Cape about the 18th of December, having experienced heavy winds for nearly the whole distance. We anticipated a moderate time in passing this noted land, as the season of the year at which we were there was considered the most favorable. But, instead of this, we experienced heavy westerly gales and a most tremendous sea that detained us off the Cape 5 weeks before we had got sufficiently to the westward to enable us to put away. Of the passage of this famous cape, it may be observed that strong westerly gales and a heavy sea are its almost universal attendants. The prevalence and constancy of this wind and sea necessarily produce a rapid current, by which vessels are set to leeward, and it is not without some favorable slant of wind that they can, in many cases, get round at all. The difficulties and dangers of the passage are proverbial, but, as far as my own observation ends, and which the numerous reports of the whalemen corroborate, you can always rely upon a long and regular sea. Although the gales may be very strong and stubborn, as they undoubtedly are, they are not known to blow with the destructive violence that characterizes some of the tornadoes of the western Atlantic Ocean. On the 17th of January, 1820, we arrived at the island of St. Mary, which lies off the coast of Chile, in latitude 3659 south, longitude 7341 west. This island is a sort of rendezvous for whalers. From it they obtain their food and water, and between it and the mainland, a distance of about 10 miles, they frequently cruise for a species of whale called the right whale. Our object in going in there was merely to get the news. We sailed thence to the island of Mas Afura, where we got some wood and fish, and thence for the cruising ground along the coast of Chile, in search of the Spermaceti-Whale. We took 8, which yielded us 250 barrels of oil. The season there having by this time expired, we changed our cruising ground to the coast of Peru, where we obtained 550 barrels. After going into a small port and replenishing our wood and water, we set sail on the 2nd of October for the Galapagos Islands. We came to anchor and laid 7 days off Hood Island, one of the group. During this time, we stopped a leak which we had discovered and obtained 300 turtle. We then visited Charles Island, where we procured 60 more. These turtles are a most delicious food. They average in weight generally about 100 pounds, but many of them weigh upwards of 800. With these, ships usually supply themselves for a great length of time, and make a great saving of other provisions. They neither eat nor drink, nor is the least pains taken with them. They are strewed over the deck, thrown underfoot, or packed away in the hold, as it suits convenience. They will live upwards of a year without food or water, but soon die in a cold climate. We left Charles Island on the 23rd of October and steered off to the westward in search of whales, in latitude 10 south, longitude 180 west. On the 16th of November, in the afternoon, we lost a boat during our work in the shoal of whales. I was in the boat myself, with 5 others, and was standing in the forepart with the harpoon in my hand, well braced, expecting every instant to catch a sight of one of the shoal which we were in, so that I might strike. But judge of my astonishment and dismay at finding myself suddenly thrown up in the air, my companions scattered about me, and the boat fast filling with water. A whale had come up directly under her and, with one dash of his tail, had stove her bottom in, and strewed us in every direction around her. We, however, with little difficulty, got safely on the wreck, and clung there until one of the other boats, which had been engaged in the shoal, came to our assistance and took us off. Strange to tell, not a man was injured by this accident. Thus it happens very frequently in the whaling business that boats are stove, oars, harpoons, and lines broken, ankles and wrists sprain, boats upset, and whole crews left for hours in the water without any of these accidents extending to the loss of life. We are so much accustomed to the continual reoccurrence of such scenes as these that we become familiarized to them. Consequently, we always feel that confidence and self-possession which teaches us every expedient in danger, and which inures the body as well as the mind to fatigue, privation, and peril, in frequent cases exceeding belief. It is this danger and hardship that makes the sailor indeed. It is the distinguishing qualification amongst us, and it is a common boast of the whaleman that he has escaped from sudden and apparent inevitable destruction oftener than his fellow. He is accordingly valued on this account, without much reference to other qualities. I have not been able to recur to the scenes which are now to become the subject of description, although a considerable time has elapsed, without feeling a mingled emotion of horror and astonishment at the most incredible destiny that has preserved me and my surviving companions from a terrible death. Frequently in my reflections on the subject, even after this lapse of time, I find myself shedding tears of gratitude for our deliverance, and blessing God, by whose divine aid and protection we were conducted through a series of unparalleled sufferings and distress and restored to the bosoms of our families and friends. There is no knowing what a stretch of pain and misery the human mind is capable of contemplating when it is wrought upon by the anxieties of preservation, nor what pangs and weaknesses the body is able to endure until they are visited upon it. And when at last deliverance comes, when the dream of hope is realized, unspeakable gratitude takes possession of the soul, and tears of joy choke the utterance. We require to be taught in the school of some signal suffering, privation, and despair the great lessons of constant dependence upon an almighty forbearance and mercy. In the midst of the wide ocean at night, when the sight of the heavens was shut out and the dark tempest came upon us, then it was that we felt ourselves ready to exclaim, "Heaven have mercy upon us, for naught but that can save us now." But I proceed to the recital. On the 20th of November, cruising on latitude 40 south, longitude 119 west, a shoal of whales was discovered off the lee bow. The weather at this time was extremely fine and clear. It was about 8 o'clock in the morning that the man at the masthead gave the usual cry of, "There she blows!" The ship was immediately put away, and we ran down in the direction for them. When we had got within half a mile of the place where they were observed, all our boats were lowered down, manned, and we started in pursuit of the shoal. The ship in the meantime was brought to the wind, and the main topsail hove aback at wait for us. I had the harpoon in the second boat. The captain preceded me in the first. When I arrived at the spot where we calculated they were, nothing was at first to be seen. We lay on our oars in anxious expectation of discovering them coming up somewhere near us, Presently one rose and spouted a short distance ahead of my boat. I made all speed towards him, came up with him, and struck him. Feeling the harpoon, he threw himself in an agony over towards the boat, which at that time was up alongside of him, and, giving a severe blow with his tail, struck the boat near the edge of the water, amidships, and strove a hole in her. I immediately took up the boat hatchet and cut the line from the harpoon to disengage the boat from the whale, which by this time was running off with great velocity. I succeeded in getting clear of him with the loss of the harpoon and line, and finding the water to pour fast in the boat, I hastily stuffed 3 or 4 of our jackets in the hole, ordered one man to keep constantly bailing, and the rest to pull immediately for the ship. We succeeded in keeping the boat free and shortly gained the ship. The captain and the second mate in the other 2 boats kept up the pursuit and soon struck another whale. They being at this time a considerable distance to leeward, I went forward, braced around the main yard, and put the ship off in a direction for them. The boat, which had been stove, was immediately hoisted in, and after examining the hole, I found that I could, by nailing a piece of canvas over it, get her ready to join in a fresh pursuit sooner than by lowering down the other remaining boat, which belonged to the ship. I accordingly turned her over the quarter and was in the act of nailing on the canvas when I observed a very large Spermaceti-Whale, as well as I could judge about 85 feet in length. He broke water about 20 rods off our weather bow and was lying quietly, with his head in a direction for the ship. He spouted 2 or 3 times and then disappeared. In less than 2 or 3 seconds he came up again, about the length of the ship off, and made directly for us at the rate of about 3 knots. The ship was then going with about the same velocity. His appearance and attitude gave us at first no alarm, but while I stood watching his movements and observing him, but a ship's length off, coming down for us with great celerity, I involuntarily ordered the boy at the helm to put it hard up, intending to sheer off and avoid him. The words were scarcely out of my mouth before he came down upon us with full speed and struck the ship with his head just forward of the forechains. He gave us such an appalling and tremendous jar as nearly threw us all on our faces. The ship brought up as suddenly and violently as if she had struck a rock and trembled for a few seconds like a leaf. We looked at each other with perfect amazement, deprived almost of the power of speech. Many minutes elapsed before we were able to realize the dreadful accident. During this time the whale passed under the ship, grazing her keel as he went along. He came up alongside of her to leeward, and lay on the top of the water, apparently stunned with the violence of the blow, for the space of a minute. Then he suddenly started off in a direction to leeward. After a few moments' reflection and recovering, in some measure from the sudden consternation that had seized us, I of course concluded that he had stove a hole in the ship, and that it would be necessary to set the pumps going. Accordingly they were rigged, but had not been in operation more than 1 minute before I perceived the head of the ship to be gradually settling down in the water. I then ordered the signal to be set for the other boats, which scarcely had I dispatched before I again discovered the whale, apparently in convulsions, on the top of the water, about 100 rods to leeward. He was enveloped in the foam of the sea that his continual and violent thrashing about in the water had created around him, and I could distinctly see him smite his jaws together, as if distracted with rage and fury. He remained a short time in this situation, and then started off with great velocity across the bow of the ship to windward. By this time the ship had settled down a considerable distance in the water, and I gave her up as lost. I, however, ordered the pumps to be kept constantly going, and endeavored to collect my thoughts for the occasion. I turned to the boats, 2 of which we then had with the ship, with an intention of clearing them away, and getting all things ready to embark in them, if there should be no other resource left. While my attention was thus engaged for a moment, I was aroused with the cry of a man at the hatchway. "Here he is! He is making for us again!" I turned around and saw him, about 100 rods directly ahead of us, coming down apparently with twice his ordinary speed, and, it appeared to me at that moment, with tenfold fury and vengeance in his aspect. The surf flew in all directions about him, and his course towards us was marked by white foam a rod in width, which he made with the continual violent thrashing of his tail. His head was about half out of water, and in that way he came upon and again struck the ship. I was in hopes, when I descried him making for us, that by a dexterous movement of putting the ship away immediately, I should be able to cross the line of his approach before he could get up to us, and thus avoid what I knew, if he should strike us again, would prove our inevitable destruction. I bawled out to the helmsman, "Hard up!" But she had not fallen off more than a point before we took the second shock. I should judge the speed of the ship to have been at this time about 3 knots, and that of the whale about 6. He struck her to windward, directly under the cathead, and completely stove in her bow. He passed under the ship again, went off to leeward, and we saw no more of him. Our situation at this juncture can be more readily imagined than described. The shock of our feelings was such as I am sure none can have an adequate conception of that were not there. The misfortune befell us at a moment when we least dreamt of any accident. From the pleasing anticipations we had formed of realizing the certain profits of our labor, we were dejected by a sudden, most mysterious, and overwhelming calamity. Not a moment, however, was to be lost in endeavoring to provide for the extremity to which it was now certain we were reduced. We were more than 1,000 miles from the nearest land, with nothing but a light open boat as the resource of safety for myself and companions. I ordered the men to cease pumping, and everyone to provide for himself. Seizing a hatchet at the same time, I cut away the lashings of the spare boat, which lay bottom up, across 2 spars directly over the quarter-deck, and cried out to those near me to take her as she came down. They did so, accordingly, and bore her on their shoulders, as far as the waist of the ship. The steward had in the meantime gone down into the cabin twice and saved 2 quadrants, 2 practical navigators, and the captain's trunk and mine. All of these were hastily thrown into the boat as she lay on the deck, along with the 2 compasses which I snatched from the binnacle. The steward attempted to descend again, but the water by this time had rushed in, and he returned without being able to effect his purpose. By the time we had got the boat to the waist, the ship was filled with water, and was going down on her beam ends. We shoved our boat as quickly as possible from the plank sheer into the water. All hands jumped in her at the same time, and we launched off clear of the ship. We were scarcely 2 boat lengths distant from her when she fell over to windward and settled down in the water. Amazement and despair now wholly took possession of us. We contemplated the frightful situation the ship lay in, and thought with horror upon the sudden and dreadful calamity that had overtaken us. We looked upon each other, as if to gather some consolatory sensation from the interchange of sentiments, but every countenance was marked with the paleness of despair. Not a word was spoken for several minutes by any of us. All appeared to be bound in a spell of stupid consternation. From the time we were first attacked by the whale to the period of the fall of the ship, and of our leaving her in the boat, more than 10 minutes could not certainly have elapsed. God only knows in what way, or by what means, we were enabled to accomplish, in that short time, what we did. The cutting away and transporting of the boat from where she was deposited would of itself, in ordinary circumstances, have consumed as much time as that if the whole ship's crew had been employed in it. My companions had not saved a single article but what they had on their backs. But to me it was a source of infinite satisfaction, if any such could be gathered from the horrors of our gloomy situation, that we had been fortunate enough to have persevered our compasses, navigators, and quadrants. After the first shock of my feelings was over, I enthusiastically contemplated them as the probable instruments of our salvation. Without them, all would have been dark and hopeless. Gracious God, what a picture of distress and suffering now presented itself to my imagination! The crew of the ship, consisting of 20 human souls, were saved. All that remained to conduct these 20 beings through the stormy terrors of the ocean, perhaps many thousand miles, were 3 open, light boats. The prospect of obtaining any provisions or water from the ship to subsist upon during the time was at least now doubtful. How many long and watchful nights, thought I, are to be passed? How many tedious days of partial starvation are to be endured before the last relief or mitigation of our sufferings can be reasonably anticipated? We lay at this time in our boat, about 2 ship lengths off from the wreck, in perfect silence, calmly contemplating her situation, and absorbed in our own melancholy reflections, when the other boats were discovered rowing up to us. They had but shortly before discovered that some accident had befallen us, but of the nature of it they were entirely ignorant. The sudden and mysterious disappearance of the ship was first discovered by the boat steerer in the captain's boat. With a horror-struck countenance and voice, he suddenly exclaimed, "Oh, my God! Where is the ship?" Upon this their operations were instantly suspended, and a general cry of horror and despair burst from the lips of every man, as their looks were directed for the ship in vain over every part of the ocean. They immediately made all haste towards us. The captain's boat was the first that reached us. He stopped about a boat's length off, but had no power to utter a single syllable. He was so completely overpowered with the spectacle before him that he sat down in his boat, pale and speechless. He appeared to be so much altered, awed, and overcome with the oppression of his feelings, and the dreadful reality that lay before him, that I could scarcely recognize his countenance. He was in a short time, however, enabled to address an inquiry to me. "My God, Mr. Chase, what is the matter?" I answered, "We have been stove by a whale." I then briefly told him the story. After a few moments' reflection, he observed that we must cut away her masts, and endeavor to get something out of her to eat. Our thoughts were now all accordingly bent on endeavors to save from the wreck whatever we might possibly want, and for this purpose we rowed up and got onto her. Search was made for every means of gaining access to her hold. For this purpose the lanyards were cut loose, and with our hatchets we commenced to cut away the masts, so that she might right up again and enable us to scuttle her decks. In doing this we were occupied about 3/4 of an hour, owing to our having no axes, nor indeed any other instruments but the small hatchets belonging to the boats. After her masts were gone, she came up about 2/3 of the way upon an even keel. While we were employed about the masts, the captain took his quadrant, shoved off from the ship, and got an observation. He found ourselves in latitude 040 south, longitude 119 west. Now we commenced to cut a hole through the planks directly above 2 large casks of bread, which most fortunately were between decks and the waist of the ship. As these were on the upper side when the ship upset, we had strong hopes they were not wet. It turned out according to our wishes, and from our casks we obtained 600 pounds of hard bread. Other parts of the deck were then scuttled, and we got without difficulty as much fresh water as we dared to take in the boats, so that each was supplied with about 65 gallons. We got also from one of the lockers a musket, a small canister of powder, a couple of files, 2 rasps, about 2 pounds of boat nails, and a few turtle. In the afternoon the wind came on to blow a strong breeze. Having obtained everything that occurred to us that could then be got out, we began to make arrangements for our safety during the night. A boat's line was made fast to the ship, and one of the boats was moored to the other end of it at about 50 fathoms to leeward. Another boat was then attached to the first one about 8 fathoms astern, and the third boat was tied the like distance astern of her. Night came on just as we had finished our operations, and such a night as it was to us, so full of feverish and distracting inquietude that we were deprived entirely of rest. The wreck was constantly before my eyes. I could not, by any effort, chase away the horrors of the preceding day from my mind. They haunted me the livelong night. My companions, some of them were like sick women, had no idea of the extent of their deplorable situation. 1 or 2 slept unconcernedly, while others wasted the night in unavailing murmurs. I now had full leisure to examine with some degree of coolness the dreadful circumstances of our disaster. The scenes of yesterday passed in such quick succession in my mind that it was not until after many hours of severe reflection that I was able to discard the idea of the catastrophe as a dream. Alas, it was one from which there was no awaking. It was too certainly true that but yesterday we had existed, as it were, and in one short moment had been cut off from all the hopes and prospects of the living. I have no language to paint the horrors of our situation. To shed tears was indeed altogether unavailing, and withal unmanly. Yet I was not able to deny myself the relief they served to afford me. After several hours of idle sorrow and repining, I began to reflect upon the accident. I endeavored to realize by what unaccountable destiny or design, which it was I could not at first determine, this sudden and most deadly attack had been made upon us by an animal never before suspected of premeditated violence and proverbial for its insensibility and inoffensiveness. Every fact seemed to warrant me in concluding that it was anything but chance which directed his operations. He made 2 separate attacks upon the ship within a short interval, both of which, according to their direction, were calculated to do us the most injury. By being made ahead, they thereby combined the speed of the 2 objects for the shock. To effect this impact, the exact maneuvers which he made were necessary. His aspect was most horrible, and such as indicated resentment and fury. He came directly from the shoal which we had just before entered, and in which we had struck 3 of his companions, as if he were fired with revenge for their sufferings. But to this it may be observed that the mode of fighting which these whales always adopts is either with repeated strokes of their tails, or by snapping of their jaws together, and that a case precisely similar to this one has never been heard of amongst the oldest and most experienced whalers. To this I would answer that the structure and strength of the whale's head is admirably designed for this mode of attack. The most prominent part of it is almost as hard and as tough as iron. Indeed, I can compare it to nothing else but the inside of a horse's hoof, upon which a lance or harpoon would not make the slightest impression. The eyes and the ears of the whale are removed nearly 1/3 the length of the whole fish from the front part of the head, and are not in the least degree endangered in this mode of attack. In all events, the whole circumstances taken together, and all happening before my own eyes, produced, at the time, impressions in my mind of decided, calculating mischief on the part of the whale, and induce me to be satisfied that I am correct in my opinion. It is certainly, in all its bearings, a hitherto unheard of circumstance, and constitutes, perhaps, the most extraordinary one in the annals of the fishery. November 21st. The morning dawned upon our wretched company. The weather was fine, but the wind blew a strong breeze from the southeast, and the sea was very rugged. Watches had been kept up during the night, in our respective boats, to see that none of the spars or other articles which continued to float out of the wreck should be thrown by the surf against the boats and injure them. At sunrise we began to think of doing something. What? We did not know. We cast loose our boats, and visited the wreck to see if anything more of consequence could be preserved, but everything looked cheerless and desolate. We made a long and vain search for any useful article. Nothing could be found but a few turtles. Of these we had enough already, or at least as many as could be safely stowed in the boats, and we wandered around in every part of the ship in a sort of vacant idleness for the greater part of the morning. Presently we were aroused to a perfect sense of our destitute and forlorn condition by thoughts of the means which we had for our subsistence, the necessity of not wasting our time, and of endeavoring to seek some relief wherever God might direct us. Our thoughts, indeed, hung about the ship, wrecked and sunken as she was, and we could scarcely discard from our minds the idea of her continuing protection. Some great efforts in our situation were necessary, and a great deal of calculation was important, as it concerned the means by which our existence was to be supported during, perhaps, a very long period, as well as a provision for our eventual deliverance. Accordingly, by agreement, all set to work in stripping off the light sails of the ship for sails for our boats. The day was consumed in making them up and fitting them. We furnished ourselves with masts and other light spars that were necessary from the wreck. Each boat was rigged with 2 masts, to carry a flying jib and 2 spritsails. The spritsails were made so that 2 reefs could be taken in them in case of heavy blows. We continued to watch the wreck for any serviceable articles that might float from her, and kept 1 man during the day on the stump of her foremast, on the lookout for vessels. Our work was very much impeded by the increase of the wind and sea, and the surf, breaking almost continually into the boats, gave us many fears that we should not be able to prevent our provisions from getting wet. Above all, it served to increase the constant apprehensions that we had of the insufficiency of the boats themselves during the rough weather that we should necessarily experience. In order to provision as much as possible against this, though withal to strengthen the slight materials of which the boats were constructed, we procured from the wreck some light cedar boards, intended to repair boats in case of accidents, with which we built up additional sides about 6 inches above the gunwale. These, we afterwards found, were of infinite service for the purpose for which they were intended. In truth, I am satisfied we could never have been preserved without them. The boats must otherwise have taken in so much water that all the efforts of 20 such weak, starving men, as we afterwards came to be, would not have sufficed to keep them free. But what appeared most immediately to concern us, and to command all our anxieties, was the security of our provisions from the salt water. We disposed of them under a covering of wood that whaleboats have at either end of them, after wrapping them up in several thicknesses of canvas. I got an observation today, by which I found we were in latitude 06 south, longitude 119.30 west, having been driven by the winds a distance of 49 miles the last 24 hours. By this, it would appear that there must have been a strong current, setting us to the northwest during the whole time. We were not able to finish our sails in 1 day. Many little things preparatory in taking a final leave of the ship were necessary to be attended to, but evening came and put an end to our labors. We made the same arrangements for mooring the boats in safety, and consigned ourselves to the horrors of another tempestuous night. The wind continued to blow hard, keeping up a heavy sea, and veering around from southeast to east and east-southeast. As the gloom of night approached and obliged us to desist from that employment which by occupying us cheated us out of some of the realities of our situation, we all of us again became mute and desponding. The preceding day a considerable degree of alacrity had been manifested by many, as their attention had been wholly engaged in scrutinizing the wreck and in constructing the sails and spars for the boats. But when they ceased to be occupied, they passed to a sudden fit of melancholy, and the miseries of their situation came upon them with such force as to produce spells of extreme debility, approaching almost to fainting. Our provisions were scarcely touched. Appetite was entirely gone. But as we had a great abundance of water, we indulged in frequent and copious draughts, which our parched mouths seemed continually to need. No one asked for bread. Our continued state of anxiety during the night excluded all hopes of sleep. Although the solemn fact had been before me for nearly 2 days, my mind still manifested the utmost repugnance to be reconciled to it. I lay down in the bottom of the boat, and resigned myself to reflection. My silent prayers were offered up to the God of mercy, for that protection which was stood so much in need of. Sometimes, indeed, a light hope would dawn, but then, to feel such an utter despondence on, and consignment to, chance alone for aid and rescue, would chase it again from my mind. The wreck, the mysterious and mortal attack of the animal, the sudden prostration and sinking of the vessel, our escape from her, and our then forlorn and almost hapless destiny, all passed in quick and perplexing review in my imagination. Wearied with the exertion of body and mind, I caught, near morning, an hour's respite from my troubles and sleep. November 22nd. The wind remained the same, and the weather continued remarkably fine. At sunrise we again hauled our boats up to the wreck, and continued our search for articles that might float out. About 7 o'clock the deck of the wreck began to give way, and every appearance indicated her speedy dissolution. The oil had bilged in the hold, and kept the surface of the sea all around us completely covered with it. The bulkheads were all washed down, and she worked in every part of her joints and seams with the violent and continual breaking of the surf over her. Seeing, at last, that little or nothing further could be done by remaining with the wreck, and as it was all important that while our provisions lasted we should make the best possible use of time, I rowed up to the captain's boat and asked him what he intended to do. I informed him that the ship's decks had bursted up and that, in all probability, she would soon go to pieces, that no further purpose could be answered by remaining longer with her, since nothing more could be obtained from her, and that it was my opinion no time should be lost in making the best of our way towards the nearest land. The captain replied that he would go once more to the wreck and survey her and, after waiting until 12 o'clock for the purpose of getting an observation, would immediately thereafter make a decision. In the meantime, before noon, all our sails were completed, and the boats otherwise got in readiness for our departure. As near as we could determine it, our observation now proved to be in latitude 013 north, longitude 120.00 west. We had crossed the equator during the night and drifted 19 miles. The wind had veered considerably to the eastward during the last 24 hours. Our nautical calculations having been completed, the captain, after visiting the wreck, called a council, consisting of himself and the first and second mates, who all repaired to his boat to interchange opinions and to devise the best means for our security and preservation. There were, in all of us, 20 men, 6 of whom were blacks, and we had 3 boats. We examined our navigators to ascertain the nearest land, and found it was the Marquesas Islands. The Society Islands were next, but we were entirely ignorant of these islands. If inhabited, we presumed it was by savages, from whom we had as much to fear as from the elements, or even death itself. We had no charts from which our calculations might be aided, and were consequently obliged to govern ourselves by the navigators alone. It was also the captain's opinion that this was the season of the hurricanes which prevail in the vicinity of the Sandwich Islands, and that, consequently, it would be unsafe to steer for them. The issue of our deliberations was that, taking all things into consideration, it would be most advisable to shape our course by the wind to the southward, as far as the latitude of 25 or 26, to fall in there with the variable winds, and then to endeavor to get eastward to the coast of Chile or Peru. Accordingly, preparations were made for our immediate departure. The boat which it was my fortune, or rather misfortune, to have, was the worst of the 3. She was old and patched up, having been stove a number of times during the cruise. At best, a whaleboat is an extremely frail thing, the most so of any other kind of boat. They are what is called clinker-built, and are constructed of the lightest materials, for the purpose of being rowed with the greatest possible celerity, which is according to the necessities of the business for which they are intended. Of all species of vessels, they are the weakest and most fragile, and possess but one advantage over any other, that of lightness and buoyancy, which enables them to keep above the dash of the sea with more facility than heavier vessels. This qualification is, however, preferable to that of any other, and situated as we then were, I would not have exchanged her, old and crazy as she was, for even a ship's launch. I am quite confident that to this quality of our boats we most especially owed our preservation through the many days and nights of heavy weather that we afterwards encountered. In consideration of my having the weakest boat, 6 men were allotted to it, while those of the captain and second mate took 7 each. At 12:30 we left the wreck, steering our course, with nearly all set sail, south-southeast. At 4 o'clock in the afternoon we lost sight of her entirely. Many were the lingering and sorrowful looks we cast behind us. It has appeared to me often since to have been, in the abstract, an extreme weakness and folly in our parts, to have looked upon our shattered and sunken vessel with such an excessive fondness and regret. But it seemed as if, in abandoning her, we had parted with all hope, and were bending our course away from her by some dictate of despair. We agreed to keep together in our boats, as nearly as possible, to afford assistance in cases of accident, and to render our reflections less melancholy by each other's presence. I found it on this occasion true that misery does indeed love company. Unaided and unencouraged by each other, there were with us many whose weak minds, I am confident, would have sunken under the dismal retrospections of the past catastrophe, and who did not possess either sense or firmness enough to contemplate our approaching destiny without the cheering of some more determined countenance than their own. The wind was strong all day, and the sea ran very high. Our boat took in water from her leaks continually, so that we were obliged to keep one man constantly bailing. During the night, the weather became extremely rugged, and the sea every now and then broke over us. By agreement, we were divided into 2 watches, one of which was to be constantly awake during the labors of the boat, such as bailing, setting, taking in, and trimming the sails. We kept our course very well together during this night, and had many opportunities of conversation with the men in the other boats, wherein the means and prospects of our deliverance were variously considered. It appeared from the opinions of all that we had most to hope for in the meeting with some vessel, most probably some whale ship. The great majority of those vessels in these seas were, we imagined, cruising about the latitude we were then steering for, but this was only a hope, the realization of which did not in any degree depend on our exertions, but on chance alone. It was not, therefore, considered prudent to go out of our course, with the prospect of meeting them, or to lose sight for one moment of the strong probabilities which, under divine providence, there were with our reaching land by the route we had prescribed for ourselves, and that depended most especially on a reasonable calculation and on our own labors. We conceived that our provisions and water, on a small allowance, would last us 60 days, and that, with the trade wind on the course we were then lying, we should be able to average the distance of a degree a day. In 26 days, this would enable us to attain the region of the variable winds, and then, in 30 more days, at the very utmost, should there be any favor in the elements, we might reach the coast. With these considerations we commenced our voyage, the total failure of which, and the subsequent dismal distress and suffering by which we were overtaken, will be shown in the sequel. Our allowance of provisions at first consisted of bread, 1 biscuit weighing about 1 pound 3 ounces, and half a pint of water a day for each man. This small quantity was less than 1/3 of that which is required by an ordinary person. Small as it was, however, we took it without murmuring, and on many an occasion afterwards blessed God that even this pittance was allowed to us in our misery. The darkness of another night overtook us, and after having for the first time partook of our allowance of bread and water, we laid our weary bodies down in the boat and endeavored to get some repose. Nature became at last worn out with the watchings and anxieties of the 2 preceding nights, and sleep came insensibly upon us. No dreams could break the strong fastenings of forgetfulness in which the mind was then locked up. But, for my own part, my thoughts so haunted me that this luxury was yet a stranger to my eyes. Every recollection was still fresh before me, and I enjoyed but a few short and unsatisfactory slumbers, caught in the intervals between my hopes and my fears. The dark ocean and swelling waters were nothing. The fears of being swallowed up by some dreadful tempest, or dashed upon hidden rocks, together with all the other ordinary subjects of fearful contemplation, seemed scarcely entitled to a moment's thought. Instead, the dismal-looking wreck and the horrid aspect and revenge of the whale wholly engrossed my reflections, until day again made its appearance. November 23rd. In my sea chest, which I was fortunate enough to preserve, I had several small articles, which we found of great service to us. Among them were some 8 or 10 sheets of writing paper, a lead pencil, a suit of clothes, 3 small fish hooks, a jackknife, a whetstone, and a cake of soap. I commenced to keep a sort of journal with the little paper and pencil which I had, and the knife, besides other useful purposes, served us as a razor. It was with much difficulty, however, that I could keep any sort of record, owing to the incessant rocking and unsteadiness of the boat, and the continual dashing of the spray of the sea over us. In addition to the articles enumerated, the boat contained a lantern, a tinder-box, and 2 or 3 candles, which belonged to her, and with which whaleboats are kept always supplied while engaged in taking whale. In addition to all of this, the captain had saved a musket, 2 pistols, and a canister containing about 2 pounds of gunpowder. The later he distributed equal proportions between the 3 boats, and gave the second mate and myself each a pistol. When morning came, we found ourselves quite near together. The wind had considerably increased since the day before. We were consequently obliged to reef our sails, and although we did not apprehend any very great danger from the then violence of the wind, it grew to be very uncomfortable in the boats from the repeated dashing of the waves, which kept our bodies constantly wet with the salt spray. We, however, stood along our course until 12 o'clock, when we got an observation, as well as we were able to obtain one, while the water flew all over us and the sea kept the boat extremely unsteady. We found ourselves this day in latitude 058 south, having repassed the equator. We abandoned the idea altogether of keeping any correct longitudinal reckoning, having no glass nor log line. The wind moderated in the course of the afternoon a little, but at night came on to blow again almost a gale. We began now to tremble for our little barque. She was so ill calculated to withstand the racking of the sea, and it required the constant labors of one man to keep her free of water. We were surrounded in the afternoon with porpoises that kept playing about us in great numbers and continued to follow us during the night. November 24th. The wind had not abated any since the preceding day, and the sea had risen to be very large, and increased, if possible, the extreme uncomfortableness of our situation. What added more than anything else to our misfortunes was that all our efforts for the preservation of our provisions proved, in a great measure, ineffectual. A heavy sea broke suddenly into the boat, and, before we could snatch our provisions up, damaged some part of them. By timely attention, however, and great caution, we managed to make them eatable, and to preserve the rest from a similar casualty. This was a subject of extreme anxiety to us. Deprived of our provisions, the expectation upon which our final rescue was founded must change at once to utter hopelessness. Our provisions were the only means of continuing us in the exercise, not only of our manual powers, but also in those of reason itself. Hence, above all other things, this was the object of our utmost solicitude and pains. We ascertained the next day that some of the provisions in the captain's boat had shared a similar fate during the night. Both of these accidents served to arouse us to a still stronger sense of our slender reliance upon the human means at our command, and to show us our utter dependence on that divine aid which we so much and more stood in need of. November 25th. No change of wind had yet taken place. We experienced the last night the same wet and disagreeable weather of the preceding one. About 8 o'clock in the morning we discovered that the water began to come fast in our boat, and in a few minutes the quantity increased to such a degree as to alarm us considerably for our safety. We commenced immediately a strict search in every part of her to discover the leak, and after tearing up the ceiling or floor of the boat near the bow, we found it proceeded from one of the streaks or outside boards having bursted off there. No time was to be lost in devising some means to repair it. The great difficulty consisted in its being in the bottom of the boat, about 6 inches from the surface of the water. To enable us to fasten the board on again, it was necessary, therefore, to have access to the outside. The leak being to leeward, we hove about, and lay to on the other tack, which brought the side of the boat nearly out of water. The captain, who was at the time ahead of us, seeing us maneuvering to get the boat about, shortened sail, presently tacked, and ran down to us. I informed him of our situation, and he came immediately alongside to our assistance. After directing all the men in the boat to get on one side, the other side, by that means, heeled out of the water a considerable distance, we then managed with a little difficulty to drive in a few nails and to secure it, much beyond our expectations. Fears of no ordinary kind were excited by this seemingly small accident. When it is recollected to what a slight vessel we had committed ourselves, our means of safety alone consisting in her capacity and endurance for many weeks, in all probability yet to come, it will not be considered strange that this little accident should not only have damped our spirits considerably, but should also have thrown a great gloominess over the natural prospects of our deliverance. On this occasion, too, we were enabled to rescue ourselves from inevitable destruction by the possession of a few nails, without which, had it not been our fortune to save some from the wreck, we would, in all human calculation, have been lost. We were still liable to the recurrence of the same accident, perhaps to a still worse one, as, in the heavy and repeated racking of the swell, the progress of our voyage would serve but to increase the incapacity and weakness of our boat. The starting of a single nail in her bottom would most assuredly prove our certain destruction. We wanted not this additional reflection to add to the miseries of our situation. November 26th. Our sufferings, heaven knows, were now sufficiently increased, and we looked forward, not without an extreme dread and anxiety, to the gloomy and disheartening prospect before us. We experienced a little abatement of wind and rough weather today, and took the opportunity of drying the bread that had been wet the day previously. To our great joy and satisfaction also, the wind hauled out to east-northeast, and enabled us to hold a much more favorable course. With these exceptions, no circumstance of any considerable interest occurred in the course of this day. The 27th of November was alike undistinguished for any incident worthy of note, except that the wind again veered back to the east and destroyed the fine prospect we had entertained of making a good run for several days to come. November 28th. The wind hauled still further to the southward and obliged us to fall off our course to the south. It commenced to blow with such violence as to put us again under short sail. The night set in extremely dark and tempestuous, and we began to entertain fears that we should be separated. We, however, with great pains, managed to keep about a ship's length apart, so that the white sails of our boats could be distinctly discernible. The captain's boat was but a short distance astern of mine, and that of the second mate a few rods to leeward of his. At about 11 o'clock at night, having lain down to sleep in the bottom of the boat, I was suddenly awakened by one of my companions, who cried out that the captain was in distress, and was calling on us for assistance. I immediately aroused myself, and listened a moment, in order to hear if anything further should be said, when the captain's loud voice arrested my attention. He was calling to the second mate, whose boat was nearer to him than mine. I made all haste to put about, ran down to him, and inquired what was the matter. He replied, "I have been attacked by an unknown fish, and he has stove my boat." It appeared that some large fish had occupied the boat for a short distance, and had suddenly made an unprovoked attack upon her, as nearly as they could determine, with its jaws. The extreme darkness of the night prevented them from distinguishing what kind of animal it was, but they judged it to be about 12 feet in length and one of the killer fish species. After having struck the boat once, he continued to play about her on every side, as if manifesting a disposition to renew the attack, and did a second time strike the bow of the boat and split her stem. They had no other instrument of offense but the sprit pole, a long, slender piece of wood by which the peak of the sail is extended, with which, after the fish's repeated attempts to destroy the boat, they succeeded in beating him off. I arrived just as he had discontinued his operations and had disappeared. He had made a considerable breach in the bow of the boat, through which the water had begun to pour fast. The captain, imagining matters to be considerably worse than they were, immediately took measures to remove his provisions into the second mate's boat and mine, in order to lighten his own. By that means, and by constant bailing, he intended to keep her above water until daylight should enable him to discover the extent of the damage and to repair it. The night was sprissy darkness itself. The sky was completely overcast, and it seemed to us as if fate was wholly relentless in pursuing us with such a cool complication of disasters. We were not without our fears that the fish might renew his attack upon one of the other boats sometime during the night, and unexpectedly destroy us. But our fears proved entirely groundless, as he was never afterwards seen. When daylight came, the wind again favored us a little, and we all lay to repair the broken boat. This was effected by nailing on thin strips of boards in the inside. Having replaced the provisions in the captain's boat, we proceeded again on our course. Our allowance of water, which in the commencement merely served to administer to the positive demands of nature, now became insufficient. We began to experience violent thirst for the consumption of the provisions that had been wet with the salt water and dried in the sun. These we were obliged to eat first to prevent their spoiling, and we could not, nay, we did not dare, to make any encroachments on our stock of water. Our determination was to suffer as long as human patience and endurance would hold out, having only in view the relief that would be afforded us when the quantity of wet provisions should be exhausted. Our extreme sufferings here first commenced. The privation of water is justly ranked among the most dreadful of the miseries of our life. The violence of raving thirst has no parallel in the category of human calamities. It was our hard lot to have felt this in its extremest force, and necessity subsequently compelled us to seek resource from one of the offices of nature. We were not at first aware of the consequences of eating this bread, and it was not until the fatal effects of it had shown themselves to a degree of oppression that we could divine the cause of our extreme thirst. But alas, there was no relief. Ignorant or instructed of the fact, the bread composed a part of our substance, and reason imposed upon us the necessity of its immediate consumption, as otherwise it would have been lost to us entirely. November 29th. Our boats appeared to be growing daily more frail and insufficient. The continual flowing of the water into them seemed increased, without our being able to assign to it anything else than a general weakness, arising from causes that must in short time, without some remedy or relief, produce their total failure. We did not neglect, however, to patch up and mend them, according to our means, whenever we could discover a broken or weak part. We this day found ourselves surrounded by a shoal of dolphins, some or one of which we tried in vain a long time to take. We had a small line from some rigging that was in the boat, fastened on one of the fish hooks, and tied it to a small piece of white rag. They took not the least notice of it, but continued playing around us nearly all day, mocking both our miseries and our efforts. November 30th. This was a remarkably fine day. The weather was not exceeded by any that we had experienced since we left the wreck. At 1 o'clock, I proposed to our boat's crew to kill one of the turtles, 2 of which we had in our possession. I need not say that the proposition was hailed with the utter enthusiasm. Hunger had set its ravenous gnawings upon our stomachs, and we waited with impatience to suck the warm flowing blood of the animal. A small fire was kindled in the shell of the turtle, and after dividing the blood, of which there was about a gill, among those of us who felt disposed to drink it, we cooked the remainder, entrails and all, and enjoyed from it an unspeakably fine repast. The stomachs of 2 or 3 revolted at the sight of the blood, and they refused to partake of it. Not even the outrageous thirst that was upon them could induce them to taste it. For myself, I took it like a medicine, to relieve the extreme dryness of my palate, and stopped not to inquire whether it was anything else than a liquid. After this, I may say, exquisite banquet, our bodies were considerably recruited, and I felt my spirits now much higher than they had been at any time before. By observation this day, we found ourselves in latitude 753 south. Our distance from the wreck, as nearly as we could calculate, was then about 480 miles. December 1st. From the 1st to the 3rd of December, exclusively nothing transpired of any moment. Our boats, as yet, kept admirably well together, and the weather was distinguished for its mildness and salubrity. We gathered consolation, too, from a favorable slant which the wind took to northeast. Our situation was not at that moment, we thought, so comfortless as we had been left at first to consider it. In our extravagant felicitations upon the blessing of the wind and the weather, we forgot our leaks, our weak boats, our own debility, our immense distance from land, and the smallness of our stock of provisions. All of these, when brought to mind with the force which they deserved, were too well calculated to dishearten us and to cause us to sigh for the hardships of our lot. Up to the 3rd of December, the raging thirst of our mouths had not been but in a small degree alleviated. Had it not been for the pains which that gave us, we should have tasted, during this spell of fine weather, a species of enjoyment derived from a momentous forgetfulness of our actual situation. December 3rd. With great joy we hailed the last crumb of our damaged bread, and commenced this day to take our allowance of healthy provisions. The salutary and agreeable effects of this change were felt at first in so slight a degree as to give us no great cause of comfort or satisfaction, but gradually, as we partook of our small allowance of water, the moisture began to collect in our mouths, and the parching fever of the palate imperceptibly left it. An accident here happened to us which gave us a great momentary spell of uneasiness. The night was dark, and the sky was completely overcast, so that we could scarcely discern each other's boats. At about 10 o'clock, that of the second mate was suddenly missing. I felt for a moment considerable alarm at her unexpected disappearance, and after a little reflection, I immediately hove to, struck a light as expeditiously as possible, and hoisted it at the masthead in a lantern. Our eyes were now directed over every part of the ocean in search of her when, to our great joy, we discerned an answering light about a quarter of a mile to leeward of us. We ran down to it, and it proved to be the lost boat. Strange as the extraordinary interest which we felt in each other's company may appear, and much as our repugnance for separation may seem to imply of weakness, it was the subject of our continual hopes and fears. It is truly remarked that our misfortune, more than anything else, serves to endear us to our companions. So strongly was this sentiment engrafted upon our feelings, and so closely were the destinies of all of us involuntarily linked together that, had one of the boats been wrecked and wholly lost with all her provisions and water, we should have felt ourselves constrained, by every tie of humanity, to have taken the surviving sufferers into the other boats, and to have shared our bread and water with them, while a crumb or one or a drop of the other remained. Hard, indeed, then would the case have been for all, and much as I have since reflected on the subject, I have not been able to realize, had it so happened, that a sense of our necessities would have allowed us to give so magnanimous and devoted a character to our feelings. I can only speak of the impressions which I recollect I had at the time. Subsequently, however, as our situation became more straitened and desperate, our conversation on this subject took a different turn. It appeared to be a universal sentiment that such a course of conduct was calculated to weaken the chances of a final deliverance for some, and also might be only the means of consigning every soul of us to a horrid death of starvation. There is no question but that an immediate separation, therefore, was the most politic measure that could be adopted, and that every boat should take its own separate chance. While we remained together, should any accident happen of the nature alluded to, only two courses could be adopted, that of taking the survivors into the other boats, and thus giving up voluntarily what we were satisfied could alone prolong our hopes and multiply the chances of our safety, or of unconcernedly witnessing their struggles in death, perhaps to beat them from our boats with weapons back into the ocean. The expectation of reaching the land was founded upon a reasonable calculation of the distance, the means, and the subsistence, which was scanty enough, God knows, and ill adapted to the probable exigencies of the voyage. In addition to our own demands in this respect, would not only injure, but also actually destroy the whole system which we had laid down and reduce us to a slight hope, derived either from the speedy death of some of our crew, or from the falling in with some vessel. With all this, however, there was a desperate instinct that bound us together. We could not reason on the subject with any degree of satisfaction to our minds, yet we continued to cling to each other with a strong and involuntary impulse. This, indeed, was a matter of no small difficulty, and it constituted, more than anything else, a source of continual watching and inquietude. We would but turn our eyes away for a few moments during some dark nights, and presently one of the boats would be missing. There was no other remedy than to heave to immediately, and set a light by which the missing boat might be directed to us. These proceedings necessarily interfered very much with our speed, and consequently lessened our hopes, but we preferred to submit to it, while the consequences were not so immediately felt, rather than to part with the consolation which each other's presence afforded. Nothing of importance took place on the 4th of December. On the 5th, at night, owing to the extreme darkness and to a strong wind, I again separated from the other boats. Finding they were not to be seen in any direction, I loaded my pistol and fired it twice. Soon after the second discharge, they made their appearance a short distance to windward. We joined company, and again kept on our course, in which we continued without any remarkable occurrence through the 6th and 7th of December. The wind during this period blew very strong, and much more unfavorably. Our boats continued to leak, and to take in a good deal of water over the gunwales. December 8th. In the afternoon of this day, the wind set in east-southeast, and began to blow much harder than we had yet experienced it. By 12 o'clock at night, it had increased to a perfect gale, with heavy showers of rain. We now began, from these dreadful indications, to prepare ourselves for destruction. We continued to take in sail by degrees, as the tempest gradually increased, until at last we were obliged to take down our masts. At this juncture we gave up entirely to the mercy of the waves. The sea and rain had wet us to the skin. We sat down silently, awaiting our fate with sullen resignation. We made an effort to catch some fresh water by spreading one of the sails, but after having spent a long time and obtained but a small quantity in a bucket, it proved to be quite as full of salt as that from the ocean. This we attributed to its having passed through the sail, which had been so often wet by the sea, and upon which, after drying so frequently in the sun, concentrations of salt had been formed. It was a dreadful night, cut off from any imaginary relief. Nothing remained but to wait the approaching issue with firmness and resignation. The appearance of the heavens was dark and dreary, and the blackness that was spread over the face of the waters was dismal beyond description. The heavy squalls that followed each other in quick succession were preceded by sharp flashes of lightning that appeared to wrap our little barge in flames. The sea rose to a fearful height, and every wave that came looked as if it must be the last that would be necessary for our destruction. To an overruling providence alone must be attributed our salvation from the horrors of that terrible night. It can be accounted for in no other way that a speck of substance, like that which we were before the driving terrors of the tempest, could have been conducted safely through it. After 12 o'clock, it began to abate a little in intervals of 2 or 3 minutes, during which we would venture to raise our heads and look to windward. Our boat was completely unmanageable. Without sails, mast, or rudder, she had been driven, in the course of the afternoon and night, we knew not whither, nor how far. When the gale had in some measure subsided, we made efforts to get a little sail upon her, and put her head towards the course we had been steering. My companions had not slept any during the whole night, and were dispirited and broken down to such a degree as to appear to want some more powerful stimulus than the fear of death to enable them to do their duty. By great exertions, however, towards morning, we again set a double-reefed mainsail and jib, and began to make tolerable progress on the voyage. An unaccountable good fortune had kept the boats together during all the troubles of the night. The sun rose and showed the disconsolate faces of our companions once more to each other. December 9th. By 12 o'clock this day, we were enabled to set all sail as usual, but there continued to be a very heavy sea running, which opened the seams of the boats and increased the leaks to an alarming degree. There was, however, no remedy for this but continual bailing, which had now come to an extremely irksome and laborious task. By observation we found ourselves in latitude 1740 south. At 11 o'clock at night, the captain's boat was unexpectedly found to be missing. After the last accident of this kind, we had agreed, if the same should again occur, that in order to save our time, the other boats should not heave to as usual, but should continue on their course until morning, and thereby save the great detention that must arise from such repeated delays. We, however, concluded on this occasion to make a small effort, which, if it did not immediately prove the means of restoring the lost boat, we would discontinue and again make sail. Accordingly, we hove to for an hour, during which time I fired my pistol twice, but, obtaining no tidings of the boat, we stood on our course. When daylight appeared, she was about 2 miles to leeward of us. Upon observing her, we immediately ran down and again joined company. December 10th through 17th. I have omitted to notice the gradual advances which hunger and thirst had made upon us for the last 6 days. As the time had lengthened since our departure from the wreck, and the allowance of provisions shortened, making the demands of the appetite daily more and more importunate, there was created in us an unusual, uncontrollable temptation to violate our resolution and satisfy, for once, the hard yearnings of nature from our stock. But a little reflection served to convince us of the imprudence and unmanliness of the measure, and it was abandoned with a sort of melancholy effort of satisfaction. I had taken into custody, by common consent, all the provisions and water belonging to the boat, and was determined that no encroachment should be made upon it without my consent. Nay, I felt myself bound by every consideration of duty, by every dictate of sense, prudence, and discretion, without which, in my situation, all the exertions would have been folly itself, to protect them at the hazard of my life. For this purpose I locked up in my chest the whole quantity, and never for a single moment closed my eyes without placing some part of my person in contact with the chest, and having loaded my pistol, I kept it constantly about me. I should not certainly have put any threats in execution. As long as the most distant hopes of reconciliation existed, I had determined, in case the least refractory disposition should be manifested, a thing which I contemplated not unlikely to happen with a set of starving wretches like ourselves, that I would immediately divide our subsistence into equal proportions and give each man's share into his own keeping. Then, should any attempt be made upon mine, which I intended to mete out to myself according to exigencies, I was resolved to make the consequence of it fatal. There was, however, the most upright and obedient behavior in this respect manifested by every man in the boat, and I never had the least opportunity of proving what my conduct would have been on such an occasion. While standing on our course this day, we came across a small shoal of flying fish, 4 of which, in their effort to avoid us, flew against the mainsail and dropped into the boat. One having fallen near me, I eagerly snatched up and devoured. The other 3 were immediately taken by the rest and eaten alive. On this occasion I felt, for the first time, a disposition to laugh, upon witnessing the ludicrous and almost desperate efforts of my 5 companions, who each sought to get a fish. They were very small of their kind, and constituted, scales, wings, and all, but an extremely delicate mouthful for hungry stomachs like ours. From the 11th to the 13th of December, inclusive, our progress was very slow, owing to light winds and calms. Nothing transpired of any moment except that, on the 11th, we killed the only remaining turtle and enjoyed another luxuriant repast, which invigorated our bodies and gave a fresh flow to our spirits. The weather was extremely hot. We were exposed to the full force of the meridian sun, without any covering to shield us from its burning influence, or the least breath of air to cool its parching rays. On the 13th day of December, we were blessed with a change of wind to the northward that brought us a most welcome and unlooked-for relief. We now, for the first time, actually felt what might be deemed a reasonable hope of our deliverance. With hearts bounding with satisfaction and bosoms swelling with joy, we made all sail to the eastward. We imagined we had run out the trade winds and had got into the variables and should, in all probability, reach the land many days sooner than we expected. But alas, our anticipations were but a dream from which we shortly experienced a cruel awakening. The wind gradually died away, and at night was succeeded by a perfect calm, which was all the more oppressive and disheartening to us after the bright prospects which had attended us during the day. The gloomy reflections that this hard fortune had given birth to were succeeded by others, of a no less cruel and discouraging nature, when we found the calm continuing during the 14th, 15th, and 16th of December inclusive. The extreme oppression of the weather, the sudden and unexpected prostration of our hopes, and the consequent dejection of our spirits set us again to thinking, and filled our souls with fearful and melancholy forebodings. In this state of affairs, seeing no alternative left us but to employ to the best advantage all human expedients in our power, I proposed, on the 14th, to reduce our allowance of provisions 1/2. No objections were made to this arrangement. All submitted, or seemed to do so, with an admirable fortitude and forbearance. The proportion which our stock of water bore to our bread was not large, and while the weather continued so oppressive, we did not think it advisable to diminish our scanty pittance. Instead, it would have been scarcely possible to have done so, with any regard for our necessities. Our thirst had become now incessantly more intolerable than hunger, and the quantity then allowed us barely sufficient to keep the mouth in a state of moisture for about 1/3 of the time. Patience and long-suffering was the constant language of our lips. Strong as the resolves of the soul could make it, we determined to cling to existence as long as hope and breath remained to us. In vain was every expedient tried to relieve the raging fever of the throat by drinking salt water and by holding small quantities of it in the mouth. By that means the thirst was increased to such a degree as even to drive us to despairing and vain relief from our own urine. Our sufferings during these calm days almost exceeded human belief. The hot rays of the sun beat down upon us to such a degree as to oblige us to hang over the gunwale of the boat into the sea to cool our weak and fainting bodies. This expedient afforded us, however, a grateful relief, and was productive of a discovery of infinite importance to us. No sooner had one of us got on the outside of the gunwale than he immediately observed the bottom of the boat to be covered with a species of small clam, which, upon being tasted, proved a most delicious and agreeable food. This was no sooner announced to us than we commenced to tear them off and to eat them for a few minutes like a set of gluttons. After having satisfied the immediate craving of the stomach, we gathered large quantities and laid them up in the boat. But hunger came upon us again in less than half an hour afterwards, within which time they had all disappeared. Upon attempting to get into the sea again, we found ourselves so weak as to require each other's assistance. Indeed, had it not been for 3 of our crew, who could not swim and who did not, therefore, get overboard, I know not by what means we should have been able to have resumed our situations in the boat. On the 15th, our boat continued to take in water so fast from her leaks, and the weather proving so moderate, we concluded to search out the bad places and to endeavor to mend them as well as we should be able. After a considerable search and after removing the ceiling near the bows, we found the principal opening was occasioned by the starting of a plank or streak in the bottom of the boat next to the keel. To remedy this, it was now absolutely necessary to have access to the bottom, though the means of doing so did not immediately occur to our minds. After a moment's reflection, however, one of the crew, Benjamin Lawrence, offered to tie a rope around his body, take a boat's hatchet in his hand, and thus go under the water. He proposed to hold the hatchet against a nail, to be driven through from the inside, for the purpose of clenching it. This was, accordingly, all effected with some little trouble, and answered the purpose much beyond our expectations. Our latitude was this day, the 15th, 2142 south. The oppression of the weather, still continuing through the 16th, bore upon our health and spirits with an amazing force and severity. The most disagreeable excitements were produced by it, which, added to the disconsolate endurance of the calm, called loudly for some mitigating expedient, some sort of relief to our prolonged sufferings. By our observations on that day, we found, in addition to our other calamities, that we had been urged back from our progress by the heave of the sea, a distance of 10 miles, and we were still without any prospect of wind. In this distressing posture of our affairs, the captain proposed that we should commence rowing, which, being seconded by all, we immediately concluded to take a double allowance of provisions and water for the day, and to row during the cool of the nights, until we should get a breeze from some quarter or other. Accordingly, when night came, we commenced our laborious operations. We made but very sorry progress. Hunger and thirst and long inactivity had so weakened us that, in 3 hours, every man gave out, and we abandoned the further prosecution of the plan. With the sunrise the next morning on the 17th, a light breeze sprung up from the southeast, and although directly ahead, it was welcomed with almost frenzied feelings of gratitude and joy. December 18th. The wind had increased this day considerably. By 12 o'clock it blew a gale, veering from southeast to east-southeast. Again we were compelled to take in all sail, and lie to for the principal part of the day. At night, however, the gale died away. The next day, the 19th, proved very moderate and pleasant weather, and we again commenced to make a little progress. December 20th. This was a day of great happiness and joy. After having experienced one of the most distressing nights in the whole catalogue of our sufferings, we awoke to a morning of comparative luxury and pleasure. About 7 o'clock, while we were sitting dispirited, silent, and dejected in our boats, one of our companions suddenly and loudly called out, "There is land!" We were all aroused in an instant, as if electrified. We cast our eyes to leeward, and there indeed was the blessed vision before us, as plain and palpable as could be wished for. A new and extraordinary impulse now took possession of us. We shook off the lethargy of our senses and seemed to take on another and fresh existence. One or two of my companions, whose lagging spirits and worn-out frames had begun to inspire them with an utter indifference to their fate, now immediately brightened up and manifested a surprising alacrity and earnestness to gain, without delay, the much-wished-for shore. It appeared at first a low white beach, and lay like a basking paradise before our longing eyes. It was discovered nearly at the same time by the other boats, and a general burst of joy and congratulation now passed between us. To divine what the feeling of our hearts were on this occasion is not within the scope of human calculation. Alternative expectation, fear, gratitude, surprise, and exultation swayed our minds and quickened our exertions. We ran down for the beach, and at 11 o'clock a.m. we were within a quarter of a mile of the shore. It was an island to all appearance, about 6 miles long and 3 broad, with a very high rugged shore, and surrounded by rocks. The sides of the mountains were bare, but the tops of them looked fresh and green with vegetation. Upon examining our navigators, we found it was Ducie Island, lying in latitude 2440 south, longitude 12440 west. A short moment sufficed for reflection, and we then made immediate arrangements to land. None of us knew whether the island was inhabited or not, nor what it afforded, if anything. If inhabited, it was uncertain whether by beasts or by savages, and a momentary suspense was created by contemplation of the dangers which might possibly arise by proceeding without due preparation and care. Hunger and thirst, however, soon determined us, and having taken the musket and pistols, I, with 3 others, effected a landing upon some sunken rocks, and waded thence to the shore. Upon arriving at the beach, it was necessary to take a little breath, and to lie down for a few minutes to rest our weak bodies, before we could proceed. Let the reader judge, if he can, what must have been our feelings now, and he will have but a faint idea of the happiness that here fell to our lot. After being bereft of all comfortable hopes of life for the space of 30 days of terrible suffering, with our bodies wasted to mere skeletons by hunger and thirst, and with death itself staring us in the face, we were suddenly and unexpectedly conducted to a rich banquet of food and drink, which subsequently we enjoyed for a few days to our full satisfaction. We now, after a few minutes, separated and went in different directions in search of water, the want of which had been our principal privation, and called for immediate relief. I had not proceeded far in my excursion before I discovered a fish, about 1.5 feet in length, swimming along in the water close to the shore. I commenced an attack upon him with the breech of my gun, and struck him, I believe, once. He ran under a small rock that lay near the shore. From there I took him with the aid of my ramrod. I brought him on the beach, and immediately fell to eating him. My companions soon joined in the repast, and in less than 10 minutes the whole was consumed, bones, skin, scales, and all. With full stomachs we imagined we could now attempt the mountains, where we considered water, if, on any part of the island, would be most probably obtained. I accordingly clambered with excessive labor, suffering and pain, up amongst the bushes, roots, and underwood of one of the crags, looking as I went in all directions in vain for every appearance of water that might present itself. There was no indication of the least moisture to be found within the distance to which I had ascended, although my strength did not enable me to get higher than about 20 feet. I was sitting down at the height that I had attained to gather a little breath, and was ruminating there upon the fruitlessness of my search, and on the constant evils and continuation of suffering that it necessarily implied, when I perceived that the tide had risen considerably since our landing. It threatened to cut off our retreat to the rocks, by which alone we should be able to regain our boats. I therefore determined to proceed again to the shore, to inform the captain and the rest of our want of success in procuring water, and to consult upon the propriety of remaining at the island any longer. I never for one moment lost sight of the main chance, which I conceive we still had, of either getting to the coast or of meeting with some vessel at sea, and I felt that every minute's detention, without some equivalent purpose, was lessening these chances by a consumption of the means of our support. When I had got down, one of my companions informed me that he had found a place in a rock some distance off, from which the water exuded in small drops at intervals of about 5 minutes. He had, by applying his lips to the rock, obtained a few of these drops, which only served to whet his appetite, and from which nothing like the least satisfaction had proceeded. Upon this information, I immediately resolved in my own mind to advise remaining until morning, in order to endeavor to make a more thorough search the next day, as well as to pick away the rock, which had been discovered with our hatchets, with the view of increasing, if possible, the run of the water. We all repaired again to our boats. There we found that the captain had the same impressions as to the propriety of our delay until morning. We therefore landed, and, having hauled our boats up on the beach, laid down in them that night. Free from all the anxieties of watching and labor, we gave ourselves up, amid our sufferings of hunger and thirst, to an unreserved forgetfulness and peace of mind that seemed so well to accord with the pleasing anticipations that this day had brought forth. It was but a short space, however, until the morning broke upon us. Sense and feeling, gnawing hunger, and the raging fever of thirst then made me redouble my wishes and efforts to explore the island again. By traversing the shore a considerable distance that night, we had obtained a few crabs and a few very small fish, but we waited until the next day, to begin the labors for which we considered a night of refreshing and undisturbed repose would better qualify us. December 21st. We had still reserved our common allowance, but it was entirely inadequate for the purpose of supplying the raging demands of the palate. Such an excessive and cruel thirst was created as almost to deprive us of the power of speech. The lips became cracked and swollen, and a sort of gluttonous saliva, disagreeable to the taste and intolerable beyond expression, collected in the mouth. Our bodies had wasted away to almost skin and bone, and possessed so little strength as often to require each other's assistance in performing some of its weakest functions. Relief, we now felt, must come soon, or nature would sink. The most perfect discipline was still maintained in respect to our provisions, and it now became our whole object, if we should not be able to replenish our substance from the island, to obtain, by some other means or other, a sufficient refreshment to enable us to prosecute our voyage. Our search for water, accordingly, again commenced with the morning. Each of us took a different direction and prosecuted the examination of every place where there was the least indication of it. The small leaves of the shrubbery afforded a temporary alleviation by being chewed in the mouth, and, for the particularly bitter taste which those of the island possessed, would have been an extremely grateful substitute. In the course of our rambles, too, we would now and then meet with tropic birds of a beautiful figure and plumage. These occupied small holes in the sides of the mountain, from whence we plucked them without the least difficulty. Upon our approaching them, they made no attempts to fly, nor did they appear to notice us at all. These birds served as for a fine repast. Numbers of them were caught in the course of the day, cooked by fires which we made on the shore, and eaten with the utmost avidity. We found also a plant, in taste not unlike the pepper grass, growing in considerable abundance in the crevices of the rocks, which proved to us a very agreeable food when chewed with the meat of the birds. These, with a few birds' nests, some of them full of young, others of eggs, which we found in the course of the day, served us for food and supplied the place of our bread. During our stay here, we had restricted ourselves from the use of this provision. But water, the great object of all our anxieties and exertions, was nowhere to be found, and we began to despair of meeting with it on the island. Our state of extreme weakness, and many of us were without shoes or any covering for the feet, prevented us from exploring any great distance, lest, by some sudden faintness or overexertion, we should not be able to return, and at night be exposed to attacks of wild beasts, which might inhabit the island, beyond the reach of the feeble assistance that otherwise could be afforded to each. We were alike incapable of resistance. The whole day was thus consumed in picking up whatever had the least shape or quality of sustenance. Before us was another night of misery, which was to be passed without a drop of water to cool our parching tongues. In this state of affairs, we would not reconcile it to ourselves to remain longer at this place. A day, An hour lost to us unnecessarily here might cost us our preservation. A drop of the water that we had in our possession might prove, in the last stages of our debility, the very cordial of life. I addressed the substance of these few reflections to the captain, who agreed with me upon the necessity of taking some decisive steps in our present dilemma. After some considerable conversation on this subject, it was finally concluded to spend the succeeding day in the further search for water and, if none should be found, to quit the island the morning after. December 22nd. We had been employed during the last night in various occupations, according to the feelings or the wants of the men. Some continued to wander about the shore and to short distances in the mountains, still seeking for food and water. Others hung about the beach, near the edge of the sea, endeavoring to take the little fish that came about them. Some slept, insensible to every feeling but rest, while others spent the night in talking of their situation and reasoning upon the probabilities of their deliverance. The dawn of day aroused us again to labor, and each of us pursued his own inclination as to the course taken over the island after water. My principal hope was founded upon my success in picking the rocks where the moisture had been discovered 2 days before, and thither I hastened as soon as my strength would enable me to get there. I was about a quarter of a mile from what I may call our encampment. With 2 men who had accompanied me, I commenced my labors with a hatchet and an old chisel. The rock proved to be very soft, and in a very short time I had obtained a considerable hole, but, alas, without the least wished-for effect. I watched it for some little time with great anxiety, hoping that, as I increased the depth of the hole, the water would presently flow, but all my hopes and efforts were unavailing. At last I desisted from further labor, and sat down near the rock in utter despair. As I turned my eyes towards the beach, I saw some of the men in the act of carrying a keg along from the boats with, I thought, an extraordinary spirit and activity. The idea suddenly darted across my mind that they had found water and were taking a keg to fill it. I quitted my seat in a moment and made my way towards them with a palpitating heart. Before I came up with them, they gave me the cheering news that they had found a spring of water. I felt at that moment as if I could have fallen down and thanked God for the signal act of his mercy. The sensation that I experienced was indeed strange, and such as I shall never forget. At one instant I felt an almost choking excess of joy, and at the next I wanted the relief of a flood of tears. When I arrived at the spot, whither I had hastened as fast as my weak legs would carry me, I found my companions had all taken their fill, with an extreme degree of forbearance. I then satisfied myself by drinking in small quantities, and at intervals of 2 or 3 minutes apart. Notwithstanding the remonstrances of prudence and, in some cases, force, many of the men had laid down and thoughtlessly swallowed large quantities of it, until they could drink no more. The effect of this was, however, neither so sudden nor bad as we had imagined. It only served to make them a little stupid and indolent for the remainder of the day. Upon examining the place from whence we had obtained this miraculous and unexpected succor, we were equally astonished and delighted at the discovery. It was on the shore. Above it the sea flowed to the depth of nearly 6 feet at high tide, and we could procure the water, therefore, from it only when the tide was down. The crevice from which the spring rose was in a flat rock. We filled our 2 kegs before the tide rose, and went back again to our boats. The remainder of this day was spent in seeking for fish, crabs, birds, and anything else that fell in our way that could contribute to satisfy our appetites. We enjoyed, during that night, a most comfortable and delicious sleep, unattended with those violent cravings of hunger and thirst that had poisoned our slumbers for so many previous ones. Since the discovery of the water, too, we began to entertain different notions altogether of our situation. There was no doubt we might here depend upon a constant and ample supply of it as long as we chose to remain, and in all probability we could manage to obtain food until the island should be visited by some vessel, or until time allowed us to devise other means of leaving it. Our boats would still remain to us, and a stay here might enable us to mend, strengthen, and put them in more perfect order for the sea, and get ourselves so far recruited as to be able to endure, if necessary, a more protracted voyage to the mainland. I made a silent determination in my own mind that I would myself pursue something like this plan, whatever might be the opinion of the rest, but I found no difference in the views of any of us as to this matter. We therefore concluded to remain at least 4 or 5 days. Within this time, it could be sufficiently known whether it would be advisable to make any arrangements for a more permanent abode. December 23rd. At 11 o'clock a.m., we again visited our spring. The tide had fallen to about a foot below it, and we were able to procure, before it rose again, about 20 gallons of water. It was at first a little brackish, but soon became fresh from the constant supply from the rock and the departure of the sea. Our observations this morning tended to give us every confidence in its quantity and quality. We therefore rested perfectly easy in our minds on the subject and commenced to make further discoveries about the island. Each man sought for his own daily living on whatever the mountains, the shore, or the sea could furnish him with. Every day during our stay there, the whole time was employed in roving about for food. We found, however, on the 24th, that we had picked up everything that could be got at in the way of sustenance, and, much to our surprise, some of the men came in at night and complained of not having gotten sufficient during the day to satisfy the cravings of their stomachs. Every accessible part of the mountain contiguous to us, or within the reach of our weak enterprise, was already ransacked for birds' eggs and grass, and was rifled of all that it contained, so we began to entertain serious apprehensions that we should not be able to live long here. With the view of being prepared as well as possible, should necessity at any time oblige us to quit the island, we commenced, on the 24th, to repair our boats. We continued to work upon them all that and the succeeding day. We were enabled to do this with much facility by drawing them up and turning them over on the beach, working by spells of 2 or 3 hours at a time, and then leaving off to seek for food. We procured our water daily, when the tide would leave the shore, but on the evening of the 25th, we found that a fruitless search for nourishment had not repaid us for the labors of a whole day. There was no one thing on the island upon which we could in the least degree rely except the pepper grass. The supply of that was precarious, and it was not much relished without some other food. Our situation here, therefore, now became worse than it would have been in our boats on the ocean. In the latter case, we should be still making some progress towards the land while our provisions lasted, and, too, the chance of falling in with some vessel would be considerably increased. It was certain that we ought not to remain here unless we felt the strongest assurances in our own minds of sufficient sustenance and regular supplies that might be depended upon. After much conversation amongst us on the subject, and after again examining our navigators, it was finally concluded to set sail for Easter Island, which we found to be east-southeast from us in latitude 27.9 south, longitude 109.35 west. All we knew of this island was that it existed as laid down in the books. Of its extent, productions, or inhabitants, if any, we were entirely ignorant. At any rate, it was nearer by 850 miles to the coast, and could not be worse in its productions than the one we were about to leave. The 26th of December was wholly employed in preparations for our departure. Our boats were hauled down to the vicinity of the spring, and our casks, and everything else that would contain water, filled with it. There had been considerable talk between 3 of our companions about their remaining on this island and taking their chance both for a living on it and an escape from it. As the time at which we were to leave drew near, they made up their minds to stay behind. The rest of us could make no objection to their plan, as it lessened the load of our boats and allowed us their share of the provisions. Moreover, the probability of their being able to sustain themselves on the island, being few in numbers, was much stronger than that of our reaching the mainland. Should we, however, ever arrive safely, it would become our duty, and so we assured them to give information of their situation and to make every effort to procure their removal from the island. Their names were William Wright of Barnstable, Massachusetts, Thomas Chappell of Plymouth, England, and Seth Weeks of the former place. They had begun, before we came away, to construct a sort of habitation, composed of the branches of trees. We left with them every little article that could be spared from the boats. It was their intention to build a considerable dwelling, which would protect them from the rains, as soon as time and materials could be provided. The captain wrote letters, which were to be left on the island. These gave information as to the fate of the ship and of ourselves, and stated that we had set out to reach Easter Island. Further details were added in an attempt to give notice of our misfortunes should our 3 fellow sufferers die there, and the place afterwards ever be visited by any vessel. These letters were put in a tin case, which was enclosed in a small wooden box and nailed to a tree on the west side of the island near our landing place. We had observed, some days previously, the name of a ship, the Elizabeth, cut out in the bark of this tree, which rendered it indubitable that a vessel of that name had once touched here. There was, however, no date to it, nor anything else by which any further particulars could be made out. December 27th. I went, before we set sail this morning, and procured for each boat a flat stone and 2 armfuls of wood, with which to make a fire in our boats, should it afterwards become necessary in the further prosecution of our voyage. We calculated we might catch a fish or a bird, and, in that case, we would be provided with the means of cooking it. Otherwise we knew, from the intense heat of the weather, that they could not be preserved from spoiling. By 10 o'clock a.m., the tide had risen far enough to allow our boats to float over the rocks. We made all sail, and steered around the island for the purpose of making a little further observation. This would not detain us any great time, and might be productive of some unexpected good fortune. Before we started, we missed our 3 companions, and found that they had not come down, either to assist us, or to get off, or take any kind of leave of us. I walked up the beach towards their rude dwelling, and informed them that we were then about to set sail, and should probably never see them more. They seemed to be very much affected, and one of them shed tears. They wished us to write to their relations, should Providence safely direct us again to our homes, but said little else. They had every confidence in being able to procure a subsistence there as long as they remained. Finding them ill at heart about taking any leave of us, I hastily bid them good-bye, hoped they would do well, and came away. They followed me with their eyes until I was out of sight, and I never saw more of them. On the northwest side of the island, we perceived a fine white beach, on which we imagined we might land and, in a short time, ascertain if any further useful discoveries could be effected, or if any addition could be made to our stock of provisions. Having set ashore 5 or 6 of the men for this purpose, the rest of us shoved off the boats and commenced fishing. We saw a number of sharks, but all efforts to take them proved ineffectual, and we got but a few small fish, about the size of a mackerel, which we divided amongst us. In this business we were occupied until 6 o'clock in the afternoon, when the men returned to the shore from their search in the mountains. They brought with them a few birds. We again set sail and steered directly for Easter Island. During that night, after we had got quite clear of the land, we had a fine strong breeze from the northwest. We kept our fires going, cooked our fish and birds, and felt our situation as comfortable as could be expected. We continued on our course, consuming our provisions and water as sparingly as possible, without any material incident until the 30th of December, when the wind hauled on east-southeast, directly ahead. It so continued until the 31st, when it again came to the northward, and we resumed our course. On the 3rd of January, we experienced heavy squalls from the west-southwest, accompanied with dreadful thunder and lightning that threw a gloomy and cheerless aspect over the ocean, and incited a recurrence of some of those heavy and desponding moments that we had before experienced. We concluded from Ducie Island to keep a regular reckoning, by which, on the 4th of January, we found we had got to the southward of Easter Island. With the wind prevailing east-northeast, we should not be able to get on to the eastward so as to reach it. Our birds and fish were all now consumed, and we had begun again upon our short allowance of bread. It was necessary in this state of things to change our determination of going to Easter Island, and to shape our course in some other direction where the wind would allow us of going. We had but little hesitation in concluding, therefore, to steer for the Juan Fernandez Islands, which lay east-southeast from us some 2,500 miles. We bent our course accordingly towards them. For the 2 succeeding days we had very light winds and suffered excessively from the intense heat of the sun. The 7th of January brought us a change of wind to the northward, and at 12 o'clock we found ourselves in latitude 3018 south, longitude 11729 west. We continued to make what progress we could to the eastward. January 10th. Matthew P. Joy, the second mate, had suffered debility from the privations we had experienced, much beyond any of the rest of us. On the 8th, he was removed to the captain's boat, under the impression that he would be more comfortable there, and that more attention and pains could be bestowed in nursing and endeavoring to comfort him. This day being calm, he manifested a desire to be taken back again, but at 4 o'clock in the afternoon, having been, according to his wishes, placed in his own boat, he died very suddenly after his removal. On the 11th, at 6 o'clock in the morning, we sewed him up in his clothes, tied a large stone to his feet, and having brought all the boats to, consigned him, in a solemn manner, to the ocean. This man did not die of absolute starvation, although his end was no doubt very much hastened by his sufferings. He had a weak and sickly constitution, and had complained of being unwell the whole voyage. It was an incident, however, which threw a gloom over our feelings for many days. In consequence of his death, one man from the captain's boat was placed in the boat from which he died to supply his place. We then stood away again on our course. On the 12th of January, we had the wind from the northwest, which commenced in the morning, and came on to blow before night a perfect gale. We were obliged to take in all sail, and to run before the wind. Flashes of lightning were quick and vivid, and the rain came down in cataracts. As, however, the gale blew us fairly on our course, and as our speed had been great during the day, we derived, I may say, even pleasure from the uncomfortableness and fury of the storm. But we were apprehensive that, in the darkness of the night, we should be separated, and made arrangements for each boat to keep to an east-southeast course all night. About 11 o'clock, my boat being ahead a short distance of the others, I turned my head back, as I was in the habit of doing every minute, and neither of the others was to be seen. It was blowing and raining at this time, as if the heavens were separating, and I knew not hardly at the moment what to do. I hove my boat to the wind, and lay drifting about an hour, expecting every moment that they would come up with me. Not seeing anything of them, I put away again, and stood on the course agreed upon, with strong hopes that daylight would enable me to discover them again. When the morning dawned, in vain did we look over every part of the ocean for our companions. They were gone, and we saw no more of them afterwards. By my observation, we separated in latitude 3216 south, longitude 11220 west. It was folly to repine at the circumstance. It could neither be remedied, nor could sorrow secure their return. But it was impossible to prevent ourselves from feeling all the poignancy and bitterness that characterizes the separation of men who have long suffered in each other's company, and whose interests and feelings fate had so closely linked together. For many days after this accident, our progress was attended with dull and melancholy reflections. We had lost the cheering of each other's faces, which, strange as it was, we so much required in both our mental and bodily distresses. The 14th of January proved another very squally and rainy day. We had now been 19 days from the island, and had only made a distance of about 900 miles. Necessity began to whisper to us that a still further reduction of our allowance must take place, or else we must abandon altogether the hopes of reaching the land and rely wholly on the chance of being taken up by a vessel. How to reduce the daily quantity of food with any regard for life itself was a question of the utmost consequence. Upon our first leaving the wreck, the demands of the stomach had been circumscribed to the smallest possible measure. Consequently, before reaching the island, there had been a diminution in this already pitiable ration of nearly 1/2, and it was now, from a reasonable calculation, necessary to curtail even that at least 1/2 again, which must, in a short time, reduce us to mere skeletons again. We had a full allowance of water, but it only served to contribute to our debility, as our bodies deprived only the scanty support which an ounce and a half of bread for each man afforded. It required a great effort to bring matters to this dreadful alternative, either to feed our bodies and our hopes a little longer, or, in the agonies of hunger, to seize upon and devour our provisions, and then coolly to await the approach of death. We were, as yet, just able to move about in our boat, and to slowly perform the necessary labors appertaining to her. But we were fast wasting away with the relaxing effects of the water, and we daily almost perished under the torrid rays of the meridian sun, to escape from which we would lie down in the bottom of the boat, cover ourselves over with the sails, and abandon her to the mercy of the waves. Upon attempting to rise again, the blood would rush into the head, and an intoxicating blindness would come over us, almost to occasion our sudden falling down again. A slight interest was still kept in our minds by the distant hopes of yet meeting with the other boats, but it was never realized. An accident occurred at night, which gave me a great cause of uneasiness, and led me to an unpleasant rumination upon the probable consequences of a repetition of it. I had lain down in the boat without taking the usual precaution of securing the lid of the provision chest, as I was accustomed to do, when one of the men awoke me and informed me that one of his companions had taken some bread from it. I felt at the moment the highest indignation and resentment at such conduct in any of our crew. I immediately took my pistol in my hand, and charged the man, if he had taken bread, to give it up without the least hesitation, or I should instantly shoot him. He became at once very much alarmed, and, trembling, confessed the fact, pleading the hard necessity that urged him to it. He appeared to be very penitent for his crime, and earnestly swore that he would never be guilty of it again. I could not find it in my soul to extend towards him the least severity on this account, however much, according to the strict imposition which we felt upon ourselves, it might demand. This was the first infraction, and the security of our lives and our hopes of redemption from our sufferings loudly called for a prompt and signal punishment, but every humane feeling of nature pled in his behalf. He was permitted to escape with the solemn injunction that a repetition of the same offense would cost him his life. I had almost determined upon this occurrence to divide our provisions and to give each man his share of the whole stock. I should have done so, in the height of my resentment, had it not been for the reflection that some might, by imprudence, be tempted to go beyond the daily allowance, or to consume it all at once, and bring on a premature weakness or starvation. This would of course disable them for the duties of the boat, and reduce our chances of safety and deliverance. On the 15th of January, at night, a very large shark was observed swimming about us in a most ravenous manner. He made attempts every now and then upon different parts of the boat, as if he would devour the very wood with hunger. Several times he came and snapped at the steering oar, and even at the stern post. We tried in vain to stab him with a lance, but we were so weak as to be unable to make any impression upon his hard skin. He was so much larger than an ordinary shark, and manifested such a fearless malignity as to make us afraid of him. Our utmost efforts, which were at first directed to kill him for prey, became in the end self-defense. Baffled, however, in all his hungry attempts upon us, he shortly made off. On the 16th of January, we were surrounded with porpoises in great numbers that followed us nearly an hour, and also defied all maneuvers to catch them. The 17th and 18th proved to be calm, but the distresses of a cheerless prospect and a burning hot sun were again visited upon our accursed heads. We began to think that divine providence had abandoned us at last, and it was but an unavailing effort to endeavor to further prolong a now tedious existence. Horrible were the feelings that took possession of us, the contemplation of a death of agony and torment, heightened by the most dreadful and distressing reflections, absolutely prostrated both body and soul. There was not a hope now remaining to us save that which was derived from a sense of the mercies of our Creator. The night of January 18th was a despairing time in our sufferings. Our minds were wrought up to the highest pitch of dread and apprehension for our fate, and in them all was dark, gloomy, and confused. About 8 o'clock, the terrible noise of whale spouts near us sounded in our ears. We could distinctly hear the furious thrashing of their tails in the water, and our weak minds pictured their appalling and hideous aspects. One of my companions, a black man, took an immediate fright and solicited me to take out the oars and to endeavor to get away from them. I consented to his using any means for that purpose, but, alas, it was wholly out of our power to raise a single arm in our own defense. 2 or 3 of the whales came down near us and went swiftly off across our stern, blowing and spouting at a terrible rate. However, after an hour or 2 they disappeared, and we saw no more of them. The next day, the 19th of January, we had extremely boisterous weather, with rain, heavy thunder, and lightning, which reduced us again to the necessity of taking in all sail and lying to. The wind blew from every point of the compass within the 24 hours, and at last, towards the next morning, settled at east-northeast, a strong breeze. January 20th. The black man, Richard Peterson, manifested today symptoms of a speedy dissolution. For the last 3 days he had been lying, utterly dispirited and broken down, between the seats in the boat, without being able to do the least duty, or hardly to place his hand to his head. This morning he had made up his mind to die, rather than to endure further misery. He refused his allowance of bread, said he was sensible of his approaching end, and was perfectly ready to die. In a few minutes he became speechless. The breath appeared to be leaving his body, without producing the least pain. At 4 o'clock he was gone. I had, 2 days previously, conversations with him on the subject of religion, on which he reasoned very sensibly, and without much composure. He begged me to let his wife know his fate if ever I reached home in safety. The next morning we committed him to the sea, in latitude 3507 south, longitude 10546 west. The wind prevailed to the eastward until the 24th of January, when it again fell calm. We were now in a most wretched and sinking state of debility, hardly able to crawl around the boat, and possessing but strength enough to convey our scanty morsel to our mouths. When I perceived this morning that it was very calm, my fortitude almost forsook me. I thought to suffer another scorching day like the last we had experienced would close before night the scene of our miseries. I felt many a despairing moment that day that had well nigh proved fatal. It required an effort beyond what I felt I was capable of making to look calmly forward and to contemplate what was yet in store for us. What it was that buoyed me, above all the terrors which surrounded us, God alone knows. Our 1.5 ounces of bread, which was to serve us all day, was in some cases greedily devoured, as if life was to continue but another moment. At other times it was hoarded up and eaten crumb by crumb, at regular intervals during the day, as if it was to last us forever. To add to our calamities, boils began to break out upon us, and our imaginations shortly became as diseased as our bodies. I lay down at night to catch a few moments of oblivious sleep, and immediately my starving fancy was at work. I dreamt of being placed near a splendid and rich repast, where there was everything that the most finicky appetite could desire, and I contemplated the moment in which we were to commence to eat with enraptured feelings of delight. Just as I was about to partake of it, I suddenly awoke to the cold realities of my miserable situation. Nothing could have oppressed me so much. It set such a longing frenzy for victuals in my mind that I felt as if I could have wished the dream to continue forever, as if I never might have awoke from it. I cast a sort of vacant stare about the boat, until my eyes rested upon a bit of tough cowhide, which was fastened to one of the oars. I eagerly seized it and commenced to chew it, but there was no substance in it, and it only served to fatigue my weak jaws and add to my bodily pains. My fellow sufferers murmured very much the whole time, and continued to press me continually with questions upon the probability of our reaching land again. I kept constantly rallying my spirits to enable me to afford them comfort. I encouraged them to bear up against all evils and, if we must perish, to die in our own cause and not weakly distrust the providence of the Almighty by giving ourselves up to despair. I reasoned with them and told them that we would not die sooner by keeping up our hopes, and that the dreadful sacrifices and privations we endured were to preserve us from death. These were not to be put in competition with the price which was set upon our lives, or with their value to our families. It was, besides, unmanly to repine at what neither admitted of alleviation nor cure. Withal, it was our solemn duty to recognize in our calamities an overruling divinity, by whose mercy we might be suddenly snatched from peril. We must rely upon him alone, who tempers the wind to the shorn lamb. The 3 following days, the 25th, 26th, and 27th, were not distinguished by any particular circumstances. The wind still prevailed to the eastward and, by its obduracy, almost tore the very hopes of our hearts away. It was impossible to silence the rebellious repinings of our nature at witnessing such a succession of hard fortune against us. It was our cruel lot not to have had one bright anticipation realized, nor one wish of our thirsting souls gratified. We had, at the end of these 3 days, been urged to the southward as far as latitude 36, into a chilly region, where rains and squalls prevailed. We now calculated to tack and stand back to the northward. After much labor, we got our boat about, and so great was the fatigue attending the small exertion of our bodies that we all gave up for a moment, and abandoned her to her own course. Not one of us had now strength sufficient to steer or, indeed, to make one single effort towards getting the sails properly trimmed to enable us to make any headway. After an hour or 2 of rest, during which the horrors of our situation came upon us with a despairing force and effect, we made a sudden effort and got our sails into such a disposition that the boat would steer herself. We then threw ourselves down, awaiting the issue of time to bring us relief, or to take us from the scene of our troubles. We could now do nothing more. Strength and spirits were totally gone. What indeed could have been the narrow hopes that in our situation then bound us to life? January 28th. Our spirits this morning were hardly sufficient to allow of our enjoying a change of the wind, which took place to the westward. It had nearly become indifferent to us from what quarter it blew. Nothing but the slight chance of meeting with a vessel remained to us now. It was this narrow comfort alone that prevented me from lying down at once to die. Only 14 days' stinted allowance of provisions remained. It was absolutely necessary, however, to increase the quantity of it, to enable us to live 5 days longer. We therefore partook of it as pinching necessity demanded, and gave ourselves wholly up to the guidance and disposal of our Creator. During the 29th and 30th of January, the wind continued west, and we made considerable progress until the 31st, when it came again from ahead and prostrated all our hopes. On the 1st of February it changed again to the westward, and on the 2nd and 3rd blew to the eastward. It was light and variable until the 8th of February. Our sufferings were now drawing to a close. A terrible death appeared shortly to await us. Hunger became violent and outrageous, and we prepared for a speedy release from our troubles. Our speech and reason were both considerably impaired, and we were reduced at this time to being certainly the most helpless and wretched of the whole human race. Isaac Cole, one of our crew, had the day before this, in a fit of despair, thrown himself down in the boat, determined to calmly wait there for death. It was obvious that he had no chance. All was dark, he said, in his mind. Not a single ray of hope was left for him to dwell upon, and it was folly and madness to be struggling against what appeared so palpably to be our fixed and settled destiny. I remonstrated with him as effectually as the weakness both of my body and my understanding would allow. What I said appeared for a moment to have a considerable effect. He made a powerful and sudden effort, half rose up, crawled forward and hoisted the jib, and firmly and loudly cried that he would not give up, that he would live as long as the rest of us. But, alas, this effort was but the hectic fever of the moment, and he shortly again relapsed into a state of melancholy and despair. This day his reason was attacked, and about 9 o'clock in the morning he became a most miserable spectacle of madness. He spoke incoherently about everything, calling loudly for a napkin and water, and then, lying stupidly and senselessly down in the boat again, closed his hollow eyes, as if in death. About 10 o'clock, we suddenly perceived that he had become speechless. We got him, as well as we were able, upon a board, which was placed on one of the seats of the boat, and after covering him up with some old clothes, we left him to his fate. He lay in the greatest pain and apparent misery, groaning piteously, until 4 o'clock in the afternoon, when he died in the most horrid and frightful convulsions I ever witnessed. We kept his corpse all night. In the morning, my two companions began, as a matter of course, to make preparations to dispose of it in the sea, when, having reflected on the subject all night, I addressed them on the painful subject of keeping the body for food. Our provisions could not possibly last us beyond 3 days. Within this time it was not in any degree probable that we should find relief from our present sufferings, and, accordingly, hunger would at last drive us to the necessity of casting lots. It was without any objection agreed to, and we set to work as fast as we were able to prepare the body so as to prevent its spoiling. We separated the limbs from the body and cut all the flesh from the bones, after which we opened the body, took out the heart, closed it again, sewing it up as decently as we could, and then committed it to the sea. We now first commenced to satisfy the immediate cravings of nature from the heart, which we eagerly devoured. We then ate sparingly of a few pieces of the flesh, after which we hung up the remainder, cut in thin strips, about the boat to dry in the sun. We made a fire and roasted some of it to serve us during the next day. In this manner did we dispose of our fellow sufferer, the painful recollection of which brings to mind at this moment some of the most disagreeable and revolting ideas that it is capable of conceiving. We knew not then to whose lot it would fall next, either to die or to be shot and eaten, like the poor wretch we had just dispatched. Humanity must shudder at the dreadful recital. I have no language to paint the anguish of our souls in this dreadful dilemma. The next morning, the 10th of February, we found that the flesh had become tainted and had turned a greenish color. We concluded to make a fire and cook it at once to prevent its becoming so putrid as not to be eatable at all. We accordingly did so, and by that means preserved it for 6 or 7 days longer. Our bread during the time remained untouched. As that would not be liable to spoil, we placed it carefully aside for the last moments of our trial. About 3 o'clock this afternoon, February 10th, a strong breeze set in from the northwest, and we made very good progress, considering that we were compelled to steer the boat by management of the sails alone. This wind continued until the 13th, when it changed again ahead. We contrived to keep soul and body together by sparingly partaking of our flesh, which was cut up in small pieces and eaten with salt water. By the 14th, our bodies became so far recruited as to enable us to make a few attempts at guiding our boat again with the oar. By each taking his turn, we managed to steer it, and to make a tolerably good course. On the 15th, our flesh was all consumed. We were driven to the last morsel of bread, consisting of 2 cakes. Our limbs had, for the last 2 days, swelled very much, and now began to pain us excessively. We were still, as near as we could judge, 300 miles from land, with but 3 days of our allowance on hand. The hope of a continuation of the wind, which came out of the west this morning, was the only comfort and solace that remained to us. So strong had our desires at last become in respect to the wind, that a high fever and a longing had set in our veins, which nothing but its continuation could satisfy. Matters with us were now at their height. All hope was cast upon the breeze, and we, tremblingly and fearfully, awaited its progress and the dreadful development of our destiny. On the 16th, at night, full of the horrible reflections of our situation, and panting with weakness, I lay down to sleep, almost indifferent whether I should ever see the light again. I had not lain long before I dreamt I saw a ship at some distance off from us. I strained every nerve to get to her, but could not. I awoke almost overpowered with the frenzy I had caught in my slumbers, and stung with the cruelties of a diseased and disappointed imagination. On the 17th, in the afternoon, a heavy cloud appeared to be setting down in the east by north direction from us, which, in my view, indicated the vicinity of some land. This I took for the island of Mas Efrira. I concluded it could be no other, and immediately upon this reflection, the life-blood began to flow again briskly in my veins. I told my companions that I was well convinced it was land, and if so, we should in all probability reach it before 2 days more. My words appeared to comfort my companions much. By repeated assurances of the favorable appearance of things, their spirits acquired even a degree of elasticity that was truly astonishing. The dark features of our distress began now to diminish a little, and the countenance, even amid the gloomy bodings of our hard lot, to assume a much fresher hue. We directed our course for the cloud, and our progress that night was extremely good. The next morning, before daylight, Thomas Nickerson, a boy about 15 years of age, and one of my 2 companions who had thus far survived with me, lay down, after having bailed the boat, drew a piece of canvas over himself, and cried out that he then wished to die immediately. I saw that he had given up, and I attempted to speak a few words of comfort and encouragement to him. I endeavored to persuade him that it was a great weakness, and even a wickedness, to abandon a reliance upon the Almighty, while the least hope and breath of life remained. But he felt unwilling to listen to any of the consolatory suggestions which I made to him, and he insisted, notwithstanding the extreme probability which I stated there was of our gaining the land before the end of 2 days more, upon lying down and giving himself up to despair. A fixed look of settled and forsaken despondency came over his face. He lay for some time silent, sullen, and sorrowful. I felt at once certain that the coldness of death was fast gathering upon him. There was a sudden and unaccountable earnestness in his manner that alarmed me, and made me fear that I myself might unexpectedly be overtaken by a like weakness or dizziness of nature, which would bereave me at once of both reason and life. But Providence willed it otherwise. At about 7 o'clock this morning, February 18th, while I was lying asleep, my companion, who was steering suddenly and loudly called out, "There's a sail!" I know not what was the first moment I made upon hearing such an unexpected cry. The earliest of my recollections is that immediately I stood up and gazed in a state of abstraction and ecstasy upon the blessed vision of a vessel about 7 miles off from us. She was standing in the same direction with us, and the only sensation I felt at the moment was that of a violent and unaccountable impulse to fly directly towards her. I do not believe it is possible to form a just conception of the pure, strong feelings and the unmingled emotions of joy and gratitude that took possession of my mind on this occasion. The boy, too, took a sudden and animated start from his despondency, and stood up to witness the probable instrument of his salvation. Our only fear now was that she would not discover us, or that we might not be able to intercept her course. However, we immediately put our boat, as well as we were able, in a direction to cut her off, and found, to our great joy, that we sailed faster than she did. Upon observing us, she shortened sail and allowed us to come up to her. The captain hailed us and asked who we were. I told him we were from a wreck, and he cried out immediately for us to come alongside the ship. I made an effort to assist myself along to the side for the purpose of getting up, but strength failed me altogether, and I found it impossible to move a step further without help. We must have formed at that moment in the eyes of the captain and his crew a most deplorable and affecting picture of suffering and misery. Our cadaverous countenances, sunken eyes, and bones just starting through the skin, with the ragged remnants of clothes stuck about our sunburnt bodies, must have produced an appearance to him affecting and revolting to the highest degree. The sailors commenced to remove us from our boat, and we were taken to the cabin and comfortably provided for in every respect. In a few minutes we were permitted to taste of a little thin food, made from tapioca, and in a few days, with prudent management, we were considerably recruited. Our rescue vessel proved to be the brig Indian, Captain William Crozon of London, to whom we are indebted for every polite, friendly, and attentive disposition towards us that can possibly be characterized a man of humanity and feeling. We were taken up in latitude 33:45 south, longitude 81:03 west. At 12 o'clock on this same day, we saw the island of Mos Afrura, and on the 25th of February, we arrived at Valparaiso in utter distress and poverty. Our wants were promptly relieved there. Captain Pollard and the lone survivor of his boat's crew were taken up by the American whaleship Dauphin, Captain Zimri Coffin of Nantucket. They arrived at Valparaiso on the following 17th of March. They had been taken up in latitude 37 south off the island of St. Mary. The third boat got separated from the captain on the 28th of January and has not been heard of since. The names of all the survivors are as follows: Captain George Pollard, Jr., Charles Ramsdell, Owen Chase, Benjamin Lawrence, and Thomas Nickerson, all of Nantucket. There died in the captain's boat the following: Brazilla Ray of Nantucket, Owen Coffin of the same place, who was shot, and Samuel Reed, a black. The captain relates that after being separated from us, as hereinbefore stated, they continued to make what progress they could towards the Juan Fernandez Islands, as was agreed upon, but contrary winds and the extreme debility of the crew prevailed against their united exertions. He was, like ourselves, equally surprised and concerned at the separation that took place between us, but continued on his course, almost confident of meeting with us again. On the 14th of January, the whole stock of provisions belonging to the second mate's boat was entirely exhausted. On the 25th, the black man, Lawson Thomas, died and was eaten by his surviving companions. On the 21st, the captain and his crew were in the like dreadful situation with respect to their provisions. On the 23rd, another colored man, Charles Shorter, died, and his body was shared for food between the crews of both boats. On the 27th, Isaiah Shepard, a black man, died in the third boat, and on the 28th, another black man, Samuel Reed, died out of the captain's boat. The bodies of these men constituted their only food while it lasted. On the 28th of January, owing to the darkness of the night and want of sufficient power to manage their boats, those of the captain and the second mate separated in latitude 35 south, longitude 100 west. On the 1st of February, having consumed their last morsel, the captain and the 3 other men that remained with him were reduced to the necessity of casting lots. It fell upon Owen Coffin to die. With great fortitude and resignation, he submitted to his fate. They drew lots to see who should shoot him. He placed himself firmly to receive his death, and was immediately shot by Charles Ramsdell, whose hard fortune it was to become his executioner. On the 11th, Brazilla Ray died. The captain and Charles Ramsdell, the only 2 that were then left, subsisted on the 2 bodies until the morning of the 23rd of February, when they fell in with the ship Dauphin, as before stated, and were snatched from impending destruction. Every assistance and attentive resource of humanity was bestowed upon them by Captain Coffin, to whom Captain Pollard acknowledged every grateful obligation. Upon making known the fact that 3 of our companions had been left at Ducie Island, to the captain of the U.S. frigate Constellation, which lay at Valparaiso, When we arrived, that officer said he should immediately take measures to have them taken off. On the 11th of June following, I arrived at Nantucket in the whaleship Eagle, Captain William H. Coffin. My family had received the most distressing account of our shipwreck and had given me up for lost. My unexpected appearance was welcomed with the most grateful obligations and acknowledgments to a beneficent Creator who had guided me through darkness, trouble, and death, once more to the bosom of my country and friends. The End.